It's the year 1700 in the opulent halls of a Baroque palace in Dresden, a city being meticulously sculpted into what would be called the Florence on the Elbe. The air is thick with the scent of 1,000 candles, illuminating priceless collections of art and the delicate newly invented Meissen porcelain that would soon take Europe by storm. This is the court of Augustus II, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, a world of ultimate refinement and cultural ambition. Now, into this scene of exquisite taste, picture the ruler himself. He's not composing a sonnet or debating philosophy. Instead, he takes a heavy, cold iron horseshoe, and with a grunt of exertion and the straining of sinew, he bends it with his bare hands until it snaps in two. This wasn't just a fleeting court rumor or a tall tale spun by fawning subjects. This was a performance, and it's a story anchored in reality. In the Dresden Royal Palace today, you can still see a horseshoe the Saxon Hercules broke in February 1711, an artifact accompanied by a document detailing the event. This singular, visceral act captures the profound paradox of the man known to history as Augustus the Strong. His famous epithet wasn't earned through political cunning or military genius. In those arenas, he was often a spectacular failure. It was earned through these personal, almost primal displays of physical power that won him his Herculean nickname even from his detractors. Born in 1670, he was the younger son of an elector, a prince with no reasonable expectation of ever ruling. His youth was spent on the grand tour of Europe, absorbing the culture of its major courts, particularly the unparalleled splendor of Louis XIV's Versailles. His life changed abruptly in 1694, when his older brother, John George IV, died of smallpox, unexpectedly elevating him to the throne of Saxony at the age of 24. But being an elector wasn't enough for a man of his ambition. His eyes were set on a royal crown, that of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Securing it required a series of audacious moves that came to be known as his Polish adventure. First, he converted to Roman Catholicism, a shocking decision for the ruler of Saxony, a bastion of German Protestantism. This act alienated many of his own subjects and his devout Lutheran wife, but it was a necessary prerequisite for the Polish throne. Then came the immense expenditure of Saxon funds to bribe the Polish nobility, whose votes were openly for sale. In 1697, his gambit paid off, and he became King Augustus II of Poland. This pursuit of glory, however, proved to be a poisoned chalice. His reign became a tale of two vastly different realms. In Saxony, he was a brilliant and transformative patron of the arts. He poured resources into his capital, Dresden, commissioning the magnificent palaces and amassing one of Europe's greatest art collections in the Green Vault. Most importantly, though, he established the Meissen factory, which unlocked the secret of true hard-paste porcelain, allowing Europe to produce Chinaware. He was, in this sphere, an undeniable and overwhelming success. In Poland and Lithuania, however, his reign was a catastrophe. He dragged the Commonwealth into the Great Northern War against the formidable Swedish crown. The conflict was a disaster for Augustus. His armies were repeatedly defeated, and he was driven from his Polish throne for several years. His actions allowed the Russian Empire to exert a growing influence that would ultimately lead to Poland's disappearance as an independent state. It's for this reason that modern biographies rightly label his career a disaster. He would eventually be brought back to the Polish throne by the Russians, but the Commonwealth was a shell of its former self. Unable to project strength through military victory or astute statecraft, he compensated in the arenas he could control. He couldn't win on the battlefield, so he staged legendary parties and built breathtaking palaces. He couldn't be a strong general, so he became a literal strongman. The legend of Augustus the Strong was built on specific, repeatable, and often shocking feats that he performed for his court and visiting dignitaries. His most famous party trick was, of course, breaking horseshoes with his bare hands. And seriously, check out the hands on this guy in his official portrait. More like bare hands, am I right? Numerous contemporary accounts describe him performing this feat, which served as the cornerstone of his reputation. He would often challenge visiting dignitaries to send their strongest bodyguard to attempt to break the horseshoe first to prove it was the real deal. Far more disturbing to modern sensibilities was his passion for a cruel aristocratic blood sport known as fox tossing, or Fuchsprellen in German. This was a competitive event where pairs of courtiers, often men and women, would stand in an enclosed courtyard holding a long sling of cloth. Terrified animals were then released and driven across the sling, at which point the participants would pull the ends taut, catapulting the creature high into the air. The goal was to achieve the highest toss, a spectacle that was often fatal for the animal, which could be a fox, hare, badger, or even a wildcat. Augustus dominated this quote-unquote sport in a way that showcased his unique power. He was known to hold his end of the sling with just a single finger, while it took two of the strongest men at his court to manage the other end. The scale of these events was staggering. At one contest he hosted in Dresden to entertain visiting royalty, a gruesome tally was kept. 647 foxes, 533 hares, 34 badgers, and 21 wildcats were tossed in a single day. These public displays of dominance over both inanimate objects and living creatures were performances of a particular kind of 18th century aristocratic masculinity. Physical power and a capacity for casual cruelty were celebrated markers of elite status. While his physical strength seems well documented, it's also important to separate it from the more outlandish myths that grew around his persona. The most famous of these is the claim that his male vitality resulted in him fathering somewhere around 400 illegitimate children with a variety of different mistresses. The true reproductive capacity of the Saxon Hercules is unknown, but he only recognized 8 illegitimate children. For centuries, the tales of Augustus's strength have been accepted as a historical fact, though no one could really explain his bizarre feats. Modern science offers a compelling biological explanation that could reconcile the seemingly impossible feats with reality. It has been theorized that Augustus may have had an extremely rare genetic condition known as myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy. To put it simply, myostatin is a protein that our bodies produce to regulate muscle growth. It acts like a brake, sending signals to our muscles to stop growing so they don't become too large. Myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy is caused by a mutation in the gene responsible for producing this protein. This mutation essentially disables the brake. The results are dramatic. Individuals with the mutation can have up to twice the usual amount of muscle mass, accompanied by significantly increased strength and reduced body fat. Crucially, the condition isn't known to cause any adverse medical problems or to impact intelligence, which aligns perfectly with the historical profile of Augustus. This genetic condition provides the most plausible mechanism for how a man of his era, without modern training or nutrition, could perform feats like snapping iron horseshoes. While it's impossible to confirm without a DNA sample, it offers a scientifically grounded hypothesis that fits the historical evidence remarkably well. There's even a tantalizing hint of a hereditary link that provides additional evidence for this. One of his ancestors from centuries earlier, Cymburgis of Masovia, was also famous for her exceptional physical strength. She was said to be able to crack open walnuts between her fingers and engage in other activities of extreme strength. Notably, these weren't viewed as positive traits for a noble woman, and contemporary records seem to indicate a sort of embarrassment about her feats of strength. This, of course, likely makes a great deal of sense given that she lived in the 15th century and may have been physically stronger than her husband. This scientific lens adds a profound layer of irony to his story. Augustus consciously built his entire public image around his strength, using it as a symbol of his innate power and will, the Saxon Hercules destined to rule. He portrayed himself as someone who worked extremely hard to cultivate his strength, and he presented it as an extension of his character. Yet, if the genetic theory is correct, this defining characteristic wasn't a product of discipline or spirit, but an involuntary biological accident. The very foundation of his carefully crafted strongman persona was likely something entirely beyond his control, a fluke of nature that he skillfully leveraged into a political asset. That said, this isn't to discount the fact that he clearly put in physical work to cultivate his strength. In the final analysis, the evidence strongly suggests that the physical power of Augustus the Strong was no myth. It was a real, observable, and probably genetic trait, vouched for by contemporary accounts and substantiated by surviving artifacts. Yet, the ultimate irony of his life is that this incredible, almost superhuman strength proved utterly useless in the arenas that truly defined a monarch's success. His life forces us to draw a sharp distinction between a strong man and a strong leader. Augustus mastered the performance of physical strength. He broke iron, he tossed wild animals with a single finger, and he cultivated an unforgettable image as the Saxon Hercules. He was, in the most literal sense of the words, a strong man, but he failed to become a strong leader. His political judgment was frequently disastrous, and his military career was a litany of failures that weakened his own position. While his son was elected as the king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Augustus didn't want any more elections. He wanted the crown to become hereditary to his family, a feat which he didn't achieve. In a bizarre twist, his lasting legacy lies not in the memory of his muscles, but in the exquisite products of a refined taste that stood in such stark contrast to the raw power of his body. His legacy instead is found in the delicate perfection of the Meissen porcelain that has been produced by the factory he founded for over 300 years. For a man whose life was a saga of conquest, violence, and world-altering change, the death of Genghis Khan is shrouded in a surprisingly dense fog of mystery. We know the when and where, August of 1227, during a brutal and final campaign against the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia, in what is now northwestern China. At around 65 years old, the great Khan was in failing health, yet he was personally overseeing a massive conflict. The Tanguts had betrayed him by refusing to provide troops for his other wars, and had allied with his enemies. His deathbed command, which his successors followed with chilling obedience, was to wipe the Tangut people and their culture from the face of the earth. This violent context is the backdrop for the central puzzle. Understanding why we don't know for certain how he died requires understanding a crucial decision made in that military camp. To prevent a collapse in morale and ensure the war could be prosecuted to its conclusion, Genghis Khan's death was ordered to be kept an absolute secret. This strategic concealment was ruthlessly enforced. According to later accounts, the funeral procession that carried his body back to a still undiscovered grave in Mongolia slaughtered anyone that crossed its path. This deliberate act of suppression created an information vacuum, a void into which rumors, legends, and competing historical narratives have rushed for nearly 800 years. The mystery of his death was a successfully executed military and political strategy, the conqueror's final direct command. The most influential and widely accepted explanation for the Khan's death comes from the Mongols themselves. This was recorded in their own foundational epic, The Secret History of the Mongols, a collection intended to educate future generations. This text, compiled for the royal family shortly after his death, is the oldest surviving literary work in the Mongolian language and our most significant native source. According to this account, the chain of events began in the winter of 1226. While on a hunt, Genghis Khan was thrown from his horse. The fall caused serious internal injuries and a high fever, but he insisted the campaign against the Tanguts continue. He lingered for months before finally dying the following summer, the clear implication being that he succumbed to complications from this accident. While this narrative comes from an unparalleled insider source, the nature of the text itself requires careful consideration. The Secret History is not a modern, objective history, but an epic chronicle, a work designed to create a foundational story for the Mongol people. To put it in a context any Crusader Kings player will instantly understand, this is essentially the commission epic decision in real life. It's not intended to be a true one-to-one account of events, but it is based in history with a strong dosage of poetic license. Notably, unlike other epics like this, Genghis Khan, while portrayed as a predestined conqueror of the world, also has distinctive flaws. For instance, its authenticity is bolstered by its inclusion of unflattering details about the hero of the tale. Genghis Khan is noted to have a fear of dogs and wolves, and most famously, the slaying of his own half-brother in a cowardly way is included. If this was a work of pure propaganda, these details would have certainly been omitted. While I don't think the instance with the brother requires any special explanation, Genghis Khan's fear of canines was extremely humiliating for a number of reasons. The Mongols deeply respected both dogs and wolves for their strength, loyalty, and spiritual significance. Dogs were seen as loyal guardians of the home and the herd and protectors against evil, while wolves were revered as ancestral symbols of courage and endurance. Further, wolves were seen as the very literal ancestors of the Mongol people, and powerful ancestors and gods were said to appear as wolves. But let's get back to this story about falling off a horse. For a culture whose entire military and social structure was built on unparalleled horsemanship, a death resulting from a fall is deeply ironic. Yet it's also a profoundly mundane end for a world conqueror. This very lack of heroic embellishment gives the story a powerful ring of truth. The significant time gap between the fall and his death also suggests that the accident wasn't the direct cause, but rather the trigger for a slow decline. This has the air of reality and reflects something that could definitely have happened. An old man who spent his life in the saddle falls off his horse, and his health declines. Simple as that. As the Mongols created a vacuum of information, their neighbors and enemies were quick to fill it with their own stories, each reflecting a different cultural perspective and political agenda. These competing narratives offer a fascinating glimpse into how the world tried to make sense of the conqueror's demise. Chinese sources, particularly the History of Yuan, which was commissioned by the new Ming dynasty, provide a more clinical, almost bureaucratic record. Compiled later but based on earlier court documents, this text states that Genghis Khan fell ill with a fever on August 18, 1227, and died just 8 days later on August 25th. It offers no explanation for the fever and makes no mention of a fall from a horse. This account, with its focus on precise dates and symptoms, reflects the meticulous record-keeping tradition of the Chinese imperial court. It doesn't contradict the Mongol account so much as it complements it. The fall could have caused the initial injury, and the fever could have been the final fatal symptom of the resulting infection or illness. European chroniclers, writing from a great distance, tended to imagine a more conventional end for a great warrior. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who served at the court of Genghis's grandson Kublai Khan decades later, wrote that the Khan died from an infection after taking an arrow to the knee. To interpolate an older meme, I used to be a world conqueror. Then I took an arrow to the knee. Another papal envoy, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, reported an even more dramatic tale, that Genghis Khan was struck by lightning. These accounts are almost certainly second-hand rumors, shaped by a European cultural lens that expected a man of such renown to be felled by an act of God. The most sensational and enduring story is also the one with the least historical credibility. This legend tells of a beautiful Tangut princess, taken as war booty, who exacted a final terrible revenge. In the dead of night, she supposedly used a hidden dagger to either stab or castrate the Khan, causing him to bleed to death before turning the blade on herself. Historians today universally dismiss this tale as folklore or propaganda. It likely emerged long after the fact as a way to give the annihilated Tangut people an act of defiant, symbolic revenge, and to tarnish the conqueror's memory. In the 21st century, the investigation into this nearly 800-year-old cold case has taken a new turn, moving from textual analysis to medical science. A 2021 study published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases applied modern paleopathology and epidemiology to the sparse clues left in the historical record. Using this information, modern scholars proposed a compelling new theory. By re-examining the clinical details from the history of Yuan, a fever and death within 8 days, researchers concluded the most likely culprit. They proposed that he likely perished from a disease that would soon sweep the world, the bubonic plague. The evidence for this diagnosis is threefold. First, the described symptoms are highly consistent with the plague, which is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Most crucially, there is contextual evidence suggesting the Mongol army was already in the grip of a plague outbreak during the Tangut campaign in 1226. The idea that the great conqueror was felled not by a blade or a fall, but by the same microscopic organism that eliminated millions of ordinary people, is powerful in its mundanity. Of course, again, this modern diagnosis doesn't necessarily exclude the fall from the horse. A severe injury could have easily weakened his body, leaving him susceptible to the plague that was already ravaging his troops. Ultimately, at present, the actual cause of death of Genghis Khan remains a historical unsolved mystery. Perhaps one day it may conclusively be solved if his burial site is found, but that too is also yet another historical enigma. Imagine you're a Roman soldier in 214 BC, part of one of the mightiest forces the world has ever known, sailing to conquer the wealthy Sicilian city of Syracuse. Your commander, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, is a celebrated general, and this should be a straightforward siege. But as your ship approaches the city's seawalls, the world turns into a nightmare. Without warning, a monstrous iron claw erupts from the fortifications, grabs the prow of the ship next to yours, and hoists it into the air as if it were a toy. The vessel is shaken violently, spilling soldiers into the sea before being smashed against the cliffs. From the walls, an unseen enemy unleashes a perfectly calibrated storm of projectiles. There are immense stones that crush ships from afar, and swarms of smaller darts that sweep the decks as you get closer. The Roman soldiers, terrified by an enemy they can't see, begin to believe they aren't fighting men at all. Marcellus himself, in a moment of despair, reportedly called his foe a geometrical Briareus, a mythical hundred-handed giant who used Roman ships like cups to ladle water from the sea. The source of this terror was a single 75-year-old man, Archimedes. He was a mathematician and engineer of such profound genius that he single-handedly held the Roman army and navy at bay. His documented machines were so effective that they cemented his reputation as a figure of almost supernatural power. Yet, among all the tales of his fearsome arsenal, one weapon stands apart. A story so spectacular it has captivated and confounded historians, scientists, and engineers for millennia. This is the shocking claim that Archimedes also wielded the sun itself, using an array of mirrors to create a heat ray that could incinerate the Roman fleet from a distance. Before we can dissect the reality or mythology of the heat ray, it's essential to understand the terrifying truth of Archimedes' confirmed inventions. Numerous ancient historians provide remarkably consistent and detailed accounts of these machines, none more feared than the claw of Archimedes. Often called the iron hand, this device was a massive crane-like lever, likely concealed behind the battlements. As a Roman quinquereme drew near the walls, the beam would swing out over the water. A heavy iron grappling hook, suspended by a chain, would be dropped onto the ship's bow. Then, through a system of ropes and what Livy describes as a massive counterweight, the machine would violently jerk the front of the ship upwards. This would lift it vertically out of the water, and the results were often catastrophic. Some ships were capsized instantly, while others were repeatedly dashed against the rocky cliffs until they splintered, all while the crew was thrown overboard. Early modern historians actually dismiss this invention of Archimedes as a likely fiction, simply because even thousands of years later, this couldn't be replicated. However, modern reconstructions have repeatedly confirmed the mechanical plausibility of the claw, lending significant weight to the accuracy of these ancient accounts. Archimedes' genius wasn't limited to this single spectacular weapon. He orchestrated the city's entire defense with a mathematician's precision, creating an arsenal designed to engage the Romans at every possible range. While the fleet was still far out at sea, it was harassed by powerful, long-range catapults and ballistae that launched immense stones, some reportedly weighing as much as 200 pounds. As the surviving vessels drew closer, a second tier of smaller, more rapid-fire machines took over, ensuring the barrage was relentless. For the final approach, when Roman marines thought they were safe under the shadow of the walls, Archimedes had another surprise. He had pierced the fortifications with a series of small loopholes through which defenders could fire missiles from small anti-personnel artillery pieces. This layered, systematic approach to defense is the true mark of his brilliance. He didn't just invent a series of weapons, he engineered a comprehensive solution that anticipated every move the Romans made. It was this systematic genius that made him seem invincible and created the fertile ground from which an even greater legend could grow. The idea of the heat ray is simple and elegant. It proposes that Archimedes used a collection of mirrors, perhaps the polished bronze shields of his soldiers, to act as a parabolic reflector. By coordinating these mirrors, the defenders could focus the sun's electromagnetic energy onto a single spot on a Roman ship. This would raise the wood's temperature to its auto-ignition point of around 300 degrees Celsius, setting it ablaze. It's a concept rooted in basic physics, the same principle that allows a magnifying glass to light a piece of paper. But when we turn from physics to history, the foundation for this story begins to crumble. The most powerful argument against the heat ray is the profound silence of the sources who should have known best. The Greek historian Polybius, writing just a few decades after the siege, provides the most detailed and reliable account of Archimedes' defenses. He likely interviewed survivors and meticulously documented the usage of the iron claw and the various catapults. Yet, in his exhaustive narrative, there isn't a single word about burning mirrors or any weapon involving harnessing the power of the sun. For a historian so focused on the specifics of technology, omitting what would have been the most spectacular weapon of all time is an almost definitive refutation. The silence is echoed by the Roman historian Livy and the Greek biographer Plutarch, both of whom wrote detailed accounts of the siege centuries later. Yet another instance of deafening silence comes from Archimedes' own contemporary, the geometer Diocles. Diocles wrote a treatise specifically titled On Burning Mirrors, in which he explored the focal properties of parabolic reflectors. He mentions Archimedes in his work, but never in connection with using such a device as a weapon at Syracuse. The historical record reveals a clear pattern of legendary embellishment over time when it comes to Archimedes. The first faint whispers connecting Archimedes to fire don't appear until the 2nd century, nearly 400 years after the siege. The writers Lucian and Galen both mention in passing that Archimedes destroyed ships with fire, but their accounts are vague, lack detail, and never mention mirrors. The first explicit, unequivocal mention of burning glasses as Archimedes' weapon comes from Anthemius of Tralles around 500, a full 700 years after the event. Crucially, Anthemius presents his description of how the device might have worked as his own speculation, not as established fact. His account was, in essence, a theoretical description of how Archimedes, one of the greatest engineers and mathematicians of all time, could have plausibly done it. He wasn't explicitly making the claim that Archimedes had actually invented a heat ray, but merely observing that he could have done so. The most vivid and detailed accounts, the ones that often form the basis of the modern legend, come from writers in the early part of the last millennium. They were working with Anthemius's hypothetical and transformed it from a plausible scenario into a definite fact. This chronological progression is a classic hallmark of myth-making. The story grows more elaborate and fantastic the further it gets from the actual event. While the historical evidence is thin, the question of scientific feasibility has kept the legend alive. Over the years, numerous experiments have tried to answer that question, yielding somewhat positive, though ultimately mixed results. The case for plausibility rests largely on 2 key experiments, and they do show that under absolutely ideal conditions that the system could work. In 1973, Greek engineer Ioannis Sakis assembled 70 sailors, each holding a large mirror, and successfully set a tar-coated plywood rowboat on fire from a distance of about 160 feet. Then, in 2005, a team of students at MIT conducted a now famous experiment using 127 one-foot square mirrors. They focused the sunlight onto a mock-up of a Roman ship made of red oak, and after about 10 minutes of sustained, uninterrupted sunlight, achieved flash ignition. These tests proved that, under the right conditions, the physics of the heat ray are sound. However, skeptics have pointed out problems. For instance, the reported successes depended on controlled stationary conditions. Yet a ship at sea constantly bobs and sways, so it's virtually impossible to keep a focused hotspot on one patch of wood for the 10+ minutes needed to ignite it. The weapon also requires perfect, uninterrupted sunlight and specific orientation, so a passing cloud or the wrong time of day would instantly render it useless. Finally, coordinating hundreds of mirror bearers to aim precisely at a small, moving target while standing exposed to enemy archers is a logistical and tactical nightmare. Skeptics have pointed out that far simpler incendiaries like flaming arrows or pots of pitch would be much more reliable. When the historical silence is weighed together with the scientific impracticality, the verdict becomes clear. The Archimedes heat ray, as a superweapon that laid waste to the Roman navy, is almost certainly a myth. The most reliable ancient historians, those who marveled at his other machines, never mention it. And modern science, while confirming the basic physics, has shown it to be a deeply flawed and unreliable weapon for the chaotic reality of ancient battle. But personally, I think the main argument against it is far simpler. Archimedes was too brilliant an engineer to have deployed a costly device so dependent on perfect weather, a stationary target, and flawless coordination. For Syracuse, this was a civilizational threat from the Romans, and dedicating such resources to a device that could so easily fail seems unlikely. He had already designed a nearly perfect weapons system to counter the siege by the far superior Roman forces. Ultimately, the reason the story still carries so much weight is because Archimedes was a genius beyond comprehension. After all, if there was anyone who could invent a solar weapon in the 3rd century BC, it would have been Archimedes. But perhaps the most interesting thing of all is that ultimately he may have invented the heat ray, but simply never deployed it. Unfortunately, most of Archimedes' works are lost to time, and there may still yet be a source that does prove that he invented the heat ray. Also, I'm thinking about doing a series on Archimedes' most wild inventions, so let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd like to watch. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, just jumping in with another reminder to hit the notification bell and share this video. Also, don't forget that you can support my work for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. He was Alfred the Great, the bastion of Christian Wessex, the king who held the line against the pagan Vikings of the great heathen army. His piety was legendary, his commitment to the church absolute. Yet, if you were to open the official history commissioned during his reign, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the very first page would present you with a stunning paradox. Before the annals of battles and laws, you'd find a genealogy, a family tree tracing Alfred's own royal line and that of all West Saxon kings, directly back to a pagan god, Woden. This wasn't an oversight or a forgotten relic. It was a declaration that these Germanic kings were of the blood of the god more widely known now as Odin. The central puzzle of the early English kingdoms is why a new Christian society would actively promote a lineage rooted in the very paganism they fought to supplant. The answer reveals that this was no contradiction, as it might initially be seen, but a masterful act of political statecraft. The continued claim of descent from Woden by Christian Anglo-Saxon kings was a sophisticated strategy. Through a clever intellectual framework, these rulers and their clerical allies transformed a pagan deity into a human ancestor. This preserved a vital source of traditional legitimacy while integrating their Germanic heritage into a new, universal Christian worldview. In the pre-Christian world of the Germanic peoples, kingship wasn't an abstract concept bestowed by some higher authority. A king's right to rule rested on a potent and visible triad of qualifications that everyone could readily understand. These were overwhelming success in battle, a reputation for generosity demonstrated by the lavish distribution of gifts to his followers, and, most critically, an impeccable ancestry. The king was more than a hardened commander. He was a judge at assemblies and a high priest at sacrifices, the essential link between his people and the divine. This connection was often understood as being quite literal, with royal families claiming direct descent from a god. For the continental Germanic peoples, various gods were preferred amongst various different tribes and groups. For the Anglo-Saxons who settled in Britain, the preeminent divine ancestor was Woden. Known to the Norse as Odin, he was a complex and powerful deity associated with wisdom, magic, strategic conflict, and crucially, royalty and kingship. The evidence from early England is stark. To wield significant power, one had to be Woden-born. This was the ideological bedrock of the right to rule. The earliest written genealogies, compiled in a text known as the Anglian Collection, show the royal houses of all the kingdoms claimed direct descendants from this god. Before these lists were ever committed to parchment by monastic scribes, they were a vibrant part of a rich oral tradition. They were maintained and performed by court poets, whose chanted recitations in the great halls served as a public and constant affirmation of the king's sacred lineage. This insistence on Woden descent effectively created a closed, hereditary elite, restricting the pool of potential rulers to a handful of families who could claim this status. While victory in conflict was necessary, it wasn't sufficient without having a decent claim to this divine lineage. Any successful commander could win a battle, but only a descendant of Woden possessed the inherent, sacred charisma to command the lasting allegiance of a kingdom. This system provided a measure of stability, preventing an endless cycle of challenges for the throne. But it also created the central crisis that Christianization would later provoke. When an entire system of legitimacy depends on descent from a pagan god, it collapses the moment the entity is reclassified as a devil. Beginning in the late 6th century with the arrival of Augustine's mission in Kent, the gradual Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms presented a profound ideological challenge. The conversion was largely a top-down affair, with missionaries targeting kings and nobles first. The motivations were often political, offering rulers access to the administrative technology of literacy, the cultural prestige of Rome, and powerful new alliances. However, the new faith brought with it a fiercely monotheistic cosmology that was fundamentally incompatible with the old ways. Christian writers, like the Venerable Bede, didn't frame the old gods as lesser or different deities. They were explicitly labeled as demons and their worship as idolatry. This theological shift was a direct assault on the foundations of royal power. A king whose primary claim to rule was his descent from Woden, a figure now deemed a cunning deceiver by the Church, faced a catastrophic crisis of legitimacy. In fact, some thought that Woden wasn't just a run-of-the-mill demon, but the very literal Prince of Darkness himself. The transition was neither swift nor smooth. The historical record reveals a long period of religious fluidity. For instance, one king of East Anglia famously maintained a temple with altars dedicated to both Christ and the Germanic gods. Many kingdoms that adopted Christianity under one ruler quickly reverted to paganism upon his death. For centuries after the official conversion, the church and state found it necessary to pass laws forbidding pagan practices, which clearly continued underground, even in noble circles. This messy reality is key to understanding the king's dilemma. To completely repudiate their Woden-born status would have been to reject their people's history and the very source of their family's inherited authority. In a society where power was personal and built on tradition, such a move would have been politically disastrous. The problem for the kings wasn't whether to keep the Woden connection, but how to keep it in a way that was compatible with their new Christian identity. The solution to this seemingly intractable problem came from an ancient intellectual tool known as euhemerism. Named for the Greek philosopher Euhemerus, this theory proposed that the gods of mythology weren't divine beings at all, but were originally great human kings and heroes. Their deeds were so remarkable that later generations had mistakenly elevated them to the status of gods. Notably, Euhemerus was himself born in the 4th century BC, which was seen as elevating this argument. It was an acknowledgement that even pre-Christian people had significant doubts about the reality of their various pantheons. Anglo-Saxon Christian intellectuals ended up adopting this euhemeristic strategy wholesale. They didn't deny Woden's existence, they simply reclassified him. He was stripped of his divinity and recast as a great, ancient, and entirely mortal king who had lived long ago on the continent. The historian Ethelward, a royal descendant himself, later wrote explicitly that Woden was merely an ancestral Germanic chieftain, whom pagans had wrongly elevated to godhood. This recategorization was the perfect compromise. It allowed a Christian king to retain his prestigious lineage and his unbroken connection to the legendary founder of his dynasty. Further, the implication of this reclassification had an obvious undertone to it. The person who was a king had been descended from someone who exhibited such unworldly power that the only rational explanation the people had was godhood. Anglo-Saxon monarchs were just as happy with this as being descended from literal gods, because in essence, it acknowledged their ancestors were equal in power to gods. Of course, the deep philosophical understanding from Euhemerus was that the legend built over centuries. However, I doubt that this was a distinction that the average medieval Anglo-Saxon of any social class aside from the clergy would actually make in practice. This strategy was put into practice in the royal genealogies, most notably preserved in the Anglian collection and the various manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They were actively compiled, edited, and expanded under direct royal patronage. A key part of the project was standardization. For example, the kings of Essex originally traced their lineage to both Woden and a different god. In later Christian-era genealogies, this other god was cleverly made a son of the now human Woden, for reasons that will become apparent shortly. The final and most audacious step in this project was to extend the pedigrees beyond Woden. The scribes constructed a new, deeper history, connecting the great ancestral king through a series of legendary figures all the way back to the biblical patriarch Noah. From there, they built on to pre-existing genealogies to prove how their kings were the direct descendants of Adam himself. While this may seem unimpressive in a world where everyone was believed to be a descendant of Adam, to have actual proof of it was a great boost to prestige. The earliest surviving manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, traces Woden's ancestry back to a figure named Scaife, who's identified as a son of Noah born on the Ark. This act subsumed the entire Germanic origin story within the universal history of the Christian Church. Woden was no longer the starting point of the royal line. He was merely a distant descendant of a biblical patriarch. The persistence of Woden in the family trees of devout Christian kings was a brilliant and necessary act of political and cultural engineering. It was a pragmatic response to the crisis of legitimacy brought on by Christianization, made possible by the elegant intellectual tool of Euhemerism. This carefully crafted lineage wasn't a contradiction to be explained away, but the very cornerstone of a new form of royal power. It allowed Anglo-Saxon kings to construct a powerful and uniquely hybrid identity. They projected an authority rooted in both the martial glory of their Germanic ancestors and the divine sanction of the Christian God. This whale tale begins not in the dim light of a dockside tavern, filled with the tall tales of sailors, but in the respected halls of 17th century science. Its protagonist is Sir Robert Sibbald, a man whose credentials lent immediate and formidable weight to his claims. He was a physician, a founder of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and the first and founding professor of medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He had been appointed Geographer Royal for Scotland, and he was a foundational figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. He was, by the standards of his day, a meticulous observer of the natural world, so much so that he is often regarded as the father of cetology, the study of whales and dolphins. It's this reputation that makes his 1687 account of a strange creature washed ashore so compelling and persistent. In his work Phalynologia Nova, a pioneering text on the whales of Scotland, Sibbald described a female whale that had stranded on the island of Orkney. It was, he reported, a type of sperm whale, but with one astonishing defining feature: an enormous dorsal fin. To convey its scale, he reached for a familiar maritime analogy, describing the fin as being similar to the mizzen mast of a ship. This single evocative phrase is the bedrock of the entire legend. A mizzen mast is the third and shortest mast on a large sailing ship. Yet even so, the comparison suggests a structure of almost unbelievable proportions. Depending on the vessel, such a mast could stand anywhere from 20 to 80 feet tall, implying a fin that would dwarf any known anatomical feature in the animal kingdom. Beyond Sibbald's foundational account, the evidentiary trail for the high-finned whale grows cold with astonishing speed. For a creature with such a dramatic appearance, its appearances in the historical record are remarkably few and far between. The entire case rests on just two primary events, separated by more than 250 years, each plagued by its own significant flaws. The first, Sibbald's 1687 observation, remains the most credible simply due to the reputation of the observer. However, despite being the first person to study whales and dolphins in a true academic sense, it's still a single anecdotal account from over 3 centuries ago. No physical evidence was preserved for future scientific scrutiny. Further, the description of the fin, as noted, was based on a poetic but imprecise metaphor, leaving its true size and shape to the imagination. Sibbald could have simply been using hyperbole to describe the size of the fin, since he very clearly didn't actually say that the fin was the equivalent in height to a mizzen mast. The second major sighting, and the only significant one of the modern era, occurred in September 1946. An unusual creature was reportedly seen trapped for 2 days in the Annapolis Basin of Nova Scotia in Canada. If Sibbald's account was ambiguous, this one was a case study in scientifically useless data. Local observers provided estimates of the animal's length that were wildly inconsistent, ranging from as little as 10 feet to as much as 100 feet. This tenfold variance suggests that no one got a clear, measurable look at the creature. The estimates for the all-important dorsal fin were equally vague and biologically absurd, also ranging between 10 and 100 feet. Despite the animal being confined to a basin for a full 48 hours, no photographs or sketches were taken of the creature. Further, this was a fishing town with whalers. If the whalers in the town truly believed they were seeing a wondrous animal, well, I suspect they may have bagged it and tagged it. The evidentiary basis for this whale is, therefore, extraordinarily fragile. It consists of one unverified report and one modern report so riddled with inconsistencies as to be meaningless. In the decades since 1946, an era of widespread photography, advanced whale-watching tourism, and sophisticated scientific surveys, there have been no new, credible sightings. The 1946 event also highlights a fundamental challenge in observing marine life: the immense difficulty of accurately judging scale and distance on the open water. With no landmarks for reference, a smaller object seen up close can easily be mistaken for a much larger object farther away. It's a perceptual trap that can easily give rise to monsters, and the hopelessly broad estimates from the Annapolis Basin suggest that the observers had fallen squarely into it. With the direct evidence for the whale proving to be so flimsy, the investigation must turn to alternative explanations. The most compelling and widely accepted scientific theory posits that the legend is not about an unknown animal, but rather a misinterpretation of a very well-known one. Orcas have the highest dorsal fins of any whale or dolphin, and dorsal fins of over 6 feet are routinely observed. Add in issues with frames of reference on open water, and this provides one explanation why this legend may have flourished. A thorough investigation requires the consideration of all possibilities, even those that are remote. While the orca misidentification theory stands as the most robust explanation, it's worth exploring whether a genuine biological anomaly could account for the sightings. One possibility is that the creature was a whale with a rare genetic mutation. It's conceivable that a mutation could cause abnormal growth of the dorsal hump or the fin, creating a larger structure. While genetic mutations are a constant in nature, the scale of the required change is problematic, since it would require an extremely substantial change. To put it in context, this would be like a human having legs that are 7 feet long. It's not outside the realm of imagination, but from evidence and observation, it's just something we know doesn't happen. However, there is a related concept called atavism, which is the reappearance of a lost ancestral trait. In rare instances, modern whales have been born with small vestigial hind limbs, a throwback to their land-dwelling ancestors. The primary flaw in this theory is the lack of any fossil evidence to suggest that the ancestors of whales ever possessed such a giant dorsal structure. Atavism can only reawaken a genetic blueprint that once existed. It can't create one from scratch. That said, the fossil record is of course extremely incomplete, so it's always possible there is actually a whale ancestor out there with a high fin that science hasn't yet discovered. Others believe that the high-finned variant of the common whale we have today may have been a very rare species which was hunted to extinction. As you'll recall, the earliest sighting was in the late 17th century, which was the very dawn of modern animal science. Believers in this theory propose that Sibyl's whale may have been the last of a creature that has never been fully documented by science. Since you can't prove a negative, this really just remains a fascinating idea at this point. Putting this theory aside, perhaps the most conclusive piece of evidence against the existence of the creature comes not from what was seen, but from what was never seen. This is the argument from silence, and its source is one of the most extensive, detailed, and brutal records of human interaction with the natural world. These are the logbooks of the global whaling industry. From the 18th century through the late 20th century, commercial whaling was a massive industrial enterprise. Fleets from America, Europe, and later Asia hunted whales across every ocean on the planet, from the equator to the polar ice. Whaling vessels were floating factories and data collection centers. By law and custom, the ship's mate was required to keep a detailed daily logbook. These logs recorded the ship's position, weather conditions, and, most importantly, every whale sighted, chased, struck, and captured. They noted the species, the size, and the yield of whale oil, and every dimension of the whale itself. Despite this, not a single high-finned whale of any species was found at any point. Ultimately, the story of this high-finned creature is likely more valuable as a lesson in the process of science than as an unsolved zoological and scientific mystery. However, the legend's persistence speaks to our enduring fascination with the mysteries of the deep ocean and what creatures might be secretly lurking beneath the waves. Personally, against all the odds, I want to believe that a small population of these majestic high-finned whales roam the seas. In a bustling village market in Haiti in 1980, a woman named Angelina Narcisse was going about her day when a man approached her. He looked gaunt, his eyes haunted, but there was something familiar about him. He called her by a childhood nickname, one only her closest family knew. The man claimed to be her brother, Clairvius Narcisse, but that was impossible. Clairvius had died and been buried 18 years earlier, in 1962. His death wasn't a vague memory either. He didn't pass away in a village in the middle of nowhere, where no one who knew him saw it happen. On April 30th, 1962, Clairvius had checked himself into the American-run Albert Schweitzer Hospital, suffering from a fever, body aches, and coughing up blood. His condition deteriorated rapidly with a host of baffling symptoms: hypothermia, low blood pressure, and a tingling sensation that spread through his body. 2 days later, American-trained doctors pronounced him dead. His sister Angelina identified his body. He was buried. Yet here he was, nearly 2 decades later, sharing intimate family secrets that no stranger could possibly know. Clairvius told a story that seemed to crawl out of the darkest corners of folklore. He claimed he had been conscious but paralyzed through his own death and burial. He remembered being dug up from his grave by a Bokor, a voodoo sorcerer, who then beat him and led him away to a sugar plantation. There, alongside other mindless captives, he was forced to work for 2 years in a hazy, dreamlike state. He only escaped when another zombie fought back and slew their captor, freeing them from the sorcerer's control. For the next 16 years he wandered Haiti in fear, only daring to return home after learning that the brother he believed had arranged the ordeal had died. The story of Clairvius Narcisse, the most well-documented case of its kind, forces us to move beyond fiction and ask a serious question. What exactly is a Haitian zombie, and could such a thing actually be real? The zombie of Haitian lore isn't a flesh-eating monster, it's a victim. The concept is deeply woven into the spiritual fabric of Haitian voodoo, which understands the human soul as a dual entity. According to this belief, there are two spirits that live inside a person, and they are separate and distinct. There is the big good angel, which is the universal life force that animates the body. But there is also the little good angel, which is the seat of your personality, your memories, your character, everything that makes you you. According to belief, a Bokor, a black magician who operates on the fringes of the formal voodoo practice, doesn't reanimate a corpse. Instead, the Bokor steals the little good angel from a living person, often through a magical powder or ritual. This act splits the soul, leaving behind a soulless body, which the Bokor can then control. The captured soul, known as the zombie astral, can be stored in a bottle or jar and used to enhance the sorcerer's power. The physical zombie is a shell, an automaton with no will, no memory, and no identity, forced to serve its new master. This belief didn't emerge from a vacuum. It's a direct and disturbing reflection of Haiti's tumultuous history. During the French colonial period, the island, then called Saint-Domingue, spent time as the world's most profitable colony by a fairly substantial margin. This profit was driven by the extremely brutal conditions on the island's sugar plantations. For the African people who made up the vast majority of the population, the only true path to freedom was a spiritual return to their ancestral homeland. The zombie mythologized the ultimate terror, a state that denied even this final escape. To become a zombie was to be trapped in your body forever, dispossessed of your very soul, and forced into eternal mindless labor. Under this theory, the soul would never have the chance to make a spiritual return, thus instilling extreme fear of zombie status. Even after Haiti's successful revolution, the zombie remained a powerful cultural force, evolving into a form of social control. Zombification isn't seen as a random act, but as a severe punishment for those who violate the community's social code. Clairvius Narcisse, for example, was allegedly targeted over a land dispute and for having abandoned his children. In rural areas where government influence was weak, clandestine secret societies sometimes act as an informal justice system, and the threat of zombification is their ultimate sanction. The case of Clairvius Narcisse was so well documented that it dragged the zombie out of folklore and into the realm of scientific inquiry. In the early 1980s, a young Harvard ethnobotanist named Wade Davis traveled to Haiti to investigate. His journey, chronicled in his famous book The Serpent and the Rainbow, sought a material explanation for the phenomenon. He didn't believe in soul-stealing magic, but he did believe in the phenomenon, and that chemistry might offer the solution. Davis plunged into the secretive world of the Bokors, and after much difficulty, managed to obtain samples of the powder they allegedly used to create zombies. His analysis revealed a complex and bizarre cocktail of ingredients, including parts of toads, lizards, human remains, and various plants. But the key ingredient, he claimed, was a potent neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin, which is found in several species of pufferfish. Davis proposed a sophisticated two-step process. First, the Bokor applies the tetrodotoxin-laced powder to the victim's skin. The powder contains irritants that create abrasions, allowing the toxin to enter the bloodstream. Tetrodotoxin works by blocking sodium channels in nerve cells, preventing them from firing. This induces a state of profound paralysis that perfectly mimics death. The victim's heart rate and breathing slow to nearly undetectable levels. Their body temperature drops, and their lips may turn blue, all symptoms reported in Narcissa's case. Crucially, the victim can remain fully conscious, aware of everything happening as they are pronounced deceased and buried alive. The second step occurs after the Bokor exhumes the victim from their grave. To revive them and maintain control, the Bokor force feeds them a paste containing Datura stramonium, known as zombie cucumber in Haiti. The psychoactive compounds in Datura induce delirium, amnesia, and a state of high suggestibility. This, Davis argued, is what keeps the zombie in a will-less, confused state, easily controlled and put to work against his or her will. Wade Davis's theory was revolutionary. It offered a plausible, scientific framework for one of the world's most enduring mysteries. However, it remains highly controversial, and today, there is no scientific consensus that zombies, as described by Davis, actually exist. The primary challenge to his work came from other scientists. When toxicologists analyzed the powder samples Davis brought back, they found, at best, only insignificant traces of tetrodotoxin. In essence, there was far too little to cause the extreme effects he had described. Critics also pointed out that reliably administering a near-lethal, but not fatal, dose of such a powerful poison through the skin would be almost impossible. They noted that to do this would essentially require the precision of an anesthesiologist. To put this in perspective, this is a medical specialty that takes about 15 years of education. This scientific skepticism has led to alternative explanations. Many researchers now believe that reported zombie cases may be tragic instances of misidentification. In a country with limited access to mental health care, individuals suffering from conditions like catatonic schizophrenia or severe disabilities might wander away from their homes. With their dazed appearance and lack of volition, they could easily be mistaken for a long-lost relative who was believed to be dead. Thus, when they return, they could be absorbed into the powerful cultural narrative of the zombie. Another compelling theory centers on the power of psychology. The cultural belief in zombies is pervasive and deeply felt in parts of Haiti. For someone who believes in the power of a Bokor, the psychological trauma an encounter with one of these dark magicians may completely shatter their sense of self. This terrifying ordeal, perhaps combined with the administration of disorienting substances, could induce a psychotic state where the victim accepts their new identity as a zombie. In this view, zombification is less a pharmacological process and more a product of profound psychological manipulation rooted in cultural belief. But let's get back to the most famous zombie case of them all before we close out this segment. There's no solid evidence proving the man who reappeared in 1980 was truly Clervius Narcisse. His identity was accepted based on family recognition, not medical or genetic proof. Poor records and the lack of verification leave open the possibility that he was an imposter or a case of mistaken identity. That said, supporters of the zombification theory note that his family had widely accepted him as the original Clairvius and that he had distinct memories that proved this. Given the poor record keeping in Haiti, it seems as though there was a dispute about where he was actually buried, so no one could just go and simply check the grave and get a quick answer. Notably, as a bit of a postscript, zombification also has a legal basis in Haiti till this day. Zombification is illegal in Haiti under Article 246 of the Penal Code, which treats inducing a permanent lethargic state as an attempt on someone's life. If a person is buried in that state, regardless of whether they live or not, the law treats the accused as being potentially guilty of slaying the zombified person. Though the law doesn't use the word zombie, it covers the same actions described in Haitian folklore. Ultimately, the Haitian zombie remains an enigma, a complex phenomenon where culture, history, pharmacology, and psychology intersect. While the evidence for a specific zombie powder is weak, the reality of the zombie in the Haitian imagination is undeniable. In a 17th century cemetery in the Polish village of Pien, archaeologists uncovered something deeply unsettling. It wasn't a tomb of riches or the grave of a king, but the small skeleton of a child, no older than 7. The child had been buried face down, a practice meant to make the deceased bite the dust if they tried to rise. And under its foot, securing it to the earth, was a triangular iron padlock. This small, locked grave is a powerful entry point into one of history's most visceral fears, the fear of the undead. This was a specific category of interment known as an apotropaic burial, a set of practices designed with one terrifying purpose in mind: to prevent the rise of a vampire. When a community feared one of its own might return, they employed a surprisingly consistent toolkit of post-mortem interventions. These practices, while gruesome, were rooted in a specific and pragmatic logic aimed at physically incapacitating the corpse. The most direct method was decapitation. The belief was straightforward. A body without a head couldn't see its way back to the world of the living. The head was often placed between the legs or at the feet, a final, definitive act of disorientation. Another common practice was face-down burial. Folkloric tradition held that if a revenant interred this way tried to claw its way out, it would only dig itself deeper into the earth. The child in Pien was buried in this manner, a symbolic and physical act to keep the supposed vampire bound to the grave. In other cases, the goal was to pin the body down. Skeletons have been found in Bulgaria, with heavy iron plowshares hammered through their chests, and in the Czech Republic, bodies were weighted down with massive rocks. In some cases, a sharp blade would be placed across the deceased's throat, positioned so that any attempt to sit up would result in decapitation. Sometimes the threat was believed to come from the mouth. In a 16th century mass plague grave in Venice, Italy, excavators found the skull of a woman with a brick jammed into her jaw. This is believed to have been done to prevent the woman from rising from the grave and releasing miasma, or bad air, from her infected lungs. Historians and scientists have tried to figure out what drove communities to take such drastic actions. The likely answer lies in a world grappling with death without the benefit of modern science. Before germ theory, the natural processes of decomposition were terrifying and easily misinterpreted. A corpse bloating with gas could appear well fed, and disturbingly, the dark purge fluid that sometimes escapes the nose and mouth could be mistaken for fresh blood. The apparent post-mortem growth of hair and nails and the slippage of skin could all be seen as signs of a horrifying, unnatural vitality. These misunderstood biological processes provided the evidence that a body was not truly at rest. This fear was weaponized during times of crisis, particularly during epidemics. A powerful belief took hold across Europe. The first person to die in an outbreak was somehow responsible for its continuation. This patient zero became a supernatural scapegoat. It was thought they would rise from the grave to prey on their surviving family and neighbors, spreading the sickness. The apotropaic burial, then, became a form of ritualized public health. It was a tangible action a community could take when faced with an invisible, unstoppable force like cholera or the plague. For a long time, it was assumed that the targets of these rituals were outsiders. Perhaps foreigners, criminals, the unbaptized, or people with physical or mental disabilities who weren't accepted in their communities during life. But modern science has profoundly challenged this theory. An interesting scientific study at a cemetery in Poland used radiogenic strontium isotope analysis on the tooth enamel of individuals in both vampire and normal graves. This analysis reveals the geology of the region where a person grew up. The results were stunning. The people buried this way were locals. In another major study, also in Poland, scientists examined hundreds of skeletons for signs of disease and disability. It found that the individuals in apotropaic graves were no more or less afflicted with noticeable disabilities than the general population. These findings force a more nuanced conclusion. The people being targeted were not necessarily outsiders or disabled. They were neighbors. They were family. Their otherness likely came not from their origin or appearance, but from the circumstances of their death. The fear wasn't the universal unease of the stranger, but a much more wicked terror. It was the fear of the familiar face of friends and family turned monstrous and unrecognizable. This fear was not born in a vacuum. It was rooted in the deep soil of Slavic and broader European folklore. The aristocratic, caped figure of modern fiction bears little resemblance to the revenants of old. The traditional Slavic vampire, known as an upir or the Romanian strigoi, was a reanimated corpse, often described as bloated and ruddy from feeding. These folk traditions also provided a detailed instruction manual for the destruction of these reanimated beings. To stop a strigoi, one had to exhume the body, drive a stake of oak or yew through its heart, decapitate it, or stuff its mouth with garlic. The striking parallels between these folkloric prescriptions and the archaeological evidence reveal a direct and powerful link between belief and ritual practice. Ultimately, anti-vampire burials are the material remains of a battle for control. In a world besieged by forces it could not understand, communities fought back with the tools they had: ritual, tradition, and an understanding of how to disable a human body. These graves are a testament to the power of belief to shape human behavior in the face of existential terror. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment saying where you're listening from. Also, don't forget that you can support my work for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. In the annals of American folklore, there are countless tales of haunted houses and vengeful spirits. However, very few of them have a future president playing a major role in the legend. It all began in 1817 on the quiet, prosperous farm of John Bell Sr. in Robertson County, Tennessee. He was a respected church elder whose family had enjoyed 13 years of peace on the frontier before their world unraveled into a nightmare from which they would never fully escape. The first sign that something was wrong on the Bell farm wasn't a ghostly wail or a rattling chain, but a bizarre creature spotted in a cornfield. John Bell described it as having the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. He fired a shot at it, and the creature simply vanished. Soon after, other strange omens appeared on the periphery of their lives. John's son Drury saw an enormous unknown bird perched on a fence, while his daughter Betsy witnessed the apparition of a young girl in a green dress swinging from a tree limb. Other family members reported being followed at a distance at night by a large, menacing black dog. These external oddities soon breached the walls of the family home. It started with faint scratching and knocking sounds on the cabin's exterior. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more insistent. The family would rush outside, weapons in hand, only to find nothing there. Before long, the sounds moved inside, manifesting as the gnawing of rats on bedposts, the ferocious snarling of invisible fighting dogs, and the heavy drag of chains. Soon the family began to hear faint whispers, like a feeble old woman singing hymns. Over weeks and months, this voice grew stronger, clearer, and more articulate, until it could carry on intelligent conversations from anywhere in the house. When asked who it was, the entity offered a confounding array of origins. It claimed to be the spirit from a disturbed Native American burial mound, a ghost searching for a lost tooth buried beneath the house, or a demon from hell. When the spirit claimed to be an astral projection of a neighbor named Kate Batts, the name Kate was adopted by the family and the community, and the entity seemed to embrace it. This being was said to demonstrate uncanny abilities, once repeating 2 different sermons word for word as they were being delivered simultaneously 13 miles apart. It knew the secret deeds and gossip of every family in the community and delighted in religious arguments, showing a deep knowledge of the Bible. Its attacks were cruelly specific, focusing almost entirely on John Bell and his youngest daughter, Betsy. Betsy was subjected to brutal physical assaults. She was slapped, pinched, stuck with pins, and had her hair violently pulled by an invisible force. Kate also developed an obsession with Betsy's love life, vehemently opposing her engagement to a young man named Joshua Gardner. The entity tormented the couple relentlessly until Betsy, broken by the harassment, finally ended the engagement in 1821. The entity reserved its deepest malice for the family patriarch John Bell, whom it mockingly called Old Jack. It cursed him constantly and openly vowed to eliminate him. Under this supernatural assault, John's health began to fail. He suffered from facial twitching, had trouble swallowing, and was eventually racked by debilitating seizures. A bizarre and psychologically twisted move, the entity showed nothing but kindness to John's wife, Lucy, calling her perfect in every way. As word of the haunting spread, the Bell Farm became a grim tourist attraction. Hundreds of people, from neighbors to curious travelers, camped on the property hoping to witness the phenomena for themselves. The legend's most famous visitor was a man who was not yet president, but was already a national hero, General Andrew Jackson. According to the story, Jackson arrived from Nashville in 1819 with an entourage, determined to investigate. As his wagon approached the Bell property, it inexplicably ground to a halt, the horses unable to pull it an inch further. Later that evening, one of Jackson's men, a self-proclaimed witch tamer, boasted that his silver bullet would destroy any evil spirit. Immediately, the so-called witch tamer began to scream in agony, claiming he was being beaten and stuck with pins before being violently kicked out of the house by an unseen force. The terrified party supposedly fled the farm the next morning, with Jackson supposedly declaring that he would fight the British Army again rather than encounter the witch. Notably, there is significant historical doubt whether Jackson was involved in this story at all. The future president kept extensive personal papers documenting every aspect of his life and never once mentioned the Bell Witch or anything like it. By the fall of 1820, Kate's relentless torment had taken its final toll. John Bell's health completely collapsed, and he was confined to his bed. On December 20th, 1820, after slipping into a coma the day before, John Bell died. In the medicine cupboard, the family found a strange vial filled with a dark liquid that none of them recognized. In a highly disturbing move, John Bell Jr., deeply suspicious, tested a small amount on the family cat, which died almost instantly. At that moment, the triumphant voice of the entity filled the room, boasting that the apparition had been responsible for everything. When the vial was thrown into the fireplace, it erupted in an eerie blue flame and shot up the chimney. The entity's final act of desecration came at John Bell's funeral, where it laughed and loudly sang rude drinking songs until the last mourner had left the graveyard. With its primary target dead, the haunting largely ceased. Kate made a few more appearances before bidding the family farewell with a promise to return in 7 years. The entity did return in 1828, not to torment, but to converse with John Bell Jr. about the past, present, and future, reportedly delivering prophecies and a promise to return in 107 years. The spirit didn't return in 1935, and if it did, no one was paying attention. Notably, the story as we know it was cemented in 1894 by Martin Ingram's book, An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch. And yes, you know it's definitely a true story when you have to call it an authenticated history. Skeptics point out the lack of contemporary written accounts of many of the most bizarre elements of the haunting before Ingram's book, which was published over 70 years after the events. While the actual death of John Sr. definitely did occur, and there was contemporary documents of supernatural activities, Ingram's book went so much further. Many historians now believe Ingram fabricated much of the tale after finding out the last surviving immediate member of the family passed away in 1890. As for what actually happened, there's contemporary evidence of elements of the haunting, and people reportedly did hear voices when around both Betsy and John Jr. One modern theory suggests that the entire thing was a hoax put together by the two, though the reasoning for this is unclear. Some have speculated that Betsy and her brother started the hoax to get her out of the engagement. As for John Bell's symptoms, some have suggested he may have had a neurological disorder, which wasn't understood at the time, or that he may have actually been poisoned over time. Whatever the case, the Bell Witch would go on to be one of the most influential ghost stories in American history. The date is February 22nd, 1803. For the fishermen of Japan's Hitachi province, it's a day like any other, until they spot something impossible drifting on the choppy Pacific waves. It's not a fishing boat, nor any kind of vessel they recognize. It's a round, covered object, bobbing ominously in the water. Their curiosity overcoming their fear, they row out and tow the strange craft to shore. What they discover inside will become one of Japan's most perplexing legends, a story that blurs the line between history, folklore, and a potential encounter with another world. This is the story of the Utsuro Bune, a hollow ship which some claim was transporting a being not from this world. The tale of the Utsuro Bune is preserved in several contemporary texts from Japan's Edo period. The details vary slightly between accounts, but they paint a remarkably consistent and specific picture of the event. The vessel itself was an object of profound strangeness. It was circular, measuring about 10 feet high and 20 feet wide. The shape reminded the witnesses of a traditional incense burner or a large rice pot. The upper half was crafted from red lacquered rosewood, but the lower half was reinforced with brazen metal plates, perhaps to protect it from rocks. The top was fitted with windows made of glass or crystal, a rarity at the time, which were sealed with tree resin and protected by bars. Peering inside, the fishermen saw strange, unintelligible writing decorating the walls. When a hatch on the vessel opened, the mystery only deepened. A young woman, estimated to be between 18 and 20 years old, emerged. She was petite, standing under 5 feet tall, but her appearance was unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. She had pale pink skin, and her hair and eyebrows were a vivid red. Her long hair was even more peculiar, lengthened with artificial white extensions that seemed to be made of fur or powdered fabric. She was dressed in elegant, flowing garments made from an unknown smooth material. The woman was polite and courteous, but she spoke a language no one could understand, and she couldn't comprehend their Japanese. She clutched a pale, rectangular box which she protected fiercely, refusing to let anyone touch it no matter how kindly or insistently they asked. Unsure what to do, the fishermen ultimately decided to place the woman back in her vessel and push her back out to sea, where she drifted away, never to be seen again. To a modern observer, the fisherman's decision seems incredibly cruel and highly questionable. However, the answer about why they did this lies not in a lack of compassion, but in the rigid political reality of early 19th century Japan. The incident occurred during the height of the Edo period, under the Tokugawa shogunate's policy of sakoku, or the chained country. For nearly 200 years, Japan had been in a state of self-imposed isolation. The shogunate, fearing the destabilizing influence of Christianity and foreign powers, had outlawed almost all contact with the outside world. Under the laws of sakoku, Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad or returning home if they had left, on pain of death. Any unauthorized foreigner who landed on Japanese soil was to be dealt with swiftly. The only sanctioned European presence was a small contingent of Dutch traders confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, hundreds of miles away. For the fishermen in Hitachi, harboring a foreigner, especially one so strange, would have been an illegal and dangerous act. In one account, a village elder specifically warns that reporting the incident to the authorities would bring trouble and great expense upon them. The sheer strangeness of the Utsuro Bune incident has invited speculation for over 2 centuries. The first formal investigation was conducted in 1844 by the writer Kyokute Bakin, who had compiled the most famous version of the tale in Toen Shosetsu. Consulting a book about Russian culture, this scholar noted that some Russian women had red hair and used white powder in their hair. He speculated that the mysterious visitor could have been a Russian, British, or even an American princess. As the part about American princesses may indicate, Japan was still closed off to the outside world at this time. Of course, the most popular modern theory is that the Utsuro Bune was an extraterrestrial spacecraft. This idea gained traction in the mid-20th century, largely because the illustrations from the Edo period texts bear an uncanny resemblance to flying saucers. Proponents of this theory argue that the vessel's advanced materials, the unknown script, and the woman's otherworldly appearance are all evidence of a close encounter. While critics point out that the craft only ever floated and never flew, the visual power of the drawings is undeniable. Still others believe that the story isn't meant to be taken literally at all, and that it's supposed to be a cautionary tale from Sakoku-era Japan. The moral of the story being, if you see someone foreign-looking washed up on the shores, push them back out to sea like the fishermen did. Notably, in some versions of the tale, the village elder tells the fishermen that if they didn't cast the foreign-looking woman away, the whole village would have been in trouble. More than 200 years after it allegedly washed ashore, the Utsuro Bune continues to captivate us. Its power lies in its perfect ambiguity. It's grounded in enough historical documentation to feel very real, yet it's filled with enough mystery to defy any simple explanation.